Good afternoon. This lecture is entitled The Civil Rights Movement and the Second Reconstruction, the years from 1945 to 1968. The Civil Rights Movement and the Second Reconstruction, 1945 to 1968. From the end of World War II until the late 1960s, often, especially historians, refer to this as America's Second Reconstruction. This is when the nation began to correct some of the civil and human rights abuses that had lingered in American society from its beginning. A grassroots civil rights movement coupled with gradual but progressive actions by presidents, the federal courts, and the Congress eventually provided more complete political rights for African Americans and began to redress some of the long-standing economic and social inequities in society. Now, while African American members of Congress from this period will play prominent roles in advocating for reform, it was largely the efforts of everyday Americans, especially African Americans, who protested segregation that will prod a reluctant Congress to pass landmark civil rights legislation in the 1960s. So today's lecture is going to focus upon what occurred with the government, especially the federal government. And as I stated in the class, there will be a second lecture that will focus upon what African Americans themselves will do. During the 1940s and the 1950s, executive actions will set the pace for the movement towards desegregation. You can say it started with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was elected in 1932, but I think his steps were very tentative. One major change that did occur with the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt is African Americans began to vote for Democrats in the North, especially in the North, instead of voting for Republicans. So with the movement, with the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, this is when African Americans began to move away from the party of Lincoln. I guess you could say the president who did much more than Roosevelt will be Harry S. Truman. And an interesting sideline point is the Truman, when he was before he became the vice president, and before he became a senator from Missouri, he had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan in Missouri, and he would say that endorsement was necessary for him to be elected. But Truman will establish the President's Committee on Civil Rights, and in 1947, this committee will issue a report that is entitled "To Secure These Rights," and this document will will provide a blueprint for the next 2 decades in terms of civil rights legislation. This document is going to recommend the creation of a permanent federal employment practices committee, the establishment of a permanent civil rights commission, the creation of a civil rights division in the United States Department of Justice, and the enforcement of federal anti-lynching laws and desegregation in interstate transportation. And this legislation, the executive order, will be signed by President Truman in 1948. But what Truman also did in 1948 that was very important is through the executive order, President Truman will desegregate the military of the United States. Remember what I've said to you all along in this course. Up to this point, African Americans had participated in the armed forces of the United States, but had done so in segregated units. And Truman will sign the executive order, which will desegregate the military. Now, there is going to be backlash. There will no doubt that there will be backlash and against what Truman did. And once again, one of the ironic points in history is that some of the Southern Democrats will break away and run their own presidential candidate in 1948. election that most pundits thought that Truman was going to lose. But one of the ironic points is that the presidential candidate for they were called Dixiecrats, the Southern Democrats, was Strom Thurmond, Strom, Thurmond, Thurmond. He was the senator from the state of South Carolina. Why do you think I'm mentioning him? Because we now know that the whole time that he was fighting against desegregation and integration, that he had fathered a child with a black woman, and he was taking care of that child and her mother. And the information on there might have been rumors in South Carolina about this, but the general public did not know that he had fathered a child with a black woman until after he died. So while he was trying to keep the races separate, I guess you could make an argument that he was doing some integration on his own. The next president will be Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower was very cautious. He was very cautious when it came to civil rights. But he is going to appoint some people that will be very crucial. And one of them will be the former governor of California, Earl Warren. And Earl Warren will become the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court in 1953. And that is going to be crucial because his appointment will pave the way for the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954 that we'll talk about in a few minutes. Okay. Eisenhower will also promote equality in the federal arena. He will desegregate Washington, D.C. He will oversee the integration of the military, and he will begin to promote minority rights in federal contracts. One of the things that he also will do that he did not want to do, well, he will be the one that will federalize the National Guard in Arkansas and will send troops to Arkansas to make sure that the Little Rock Nine were able to desegregate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. He did not want to do that, but the protesters, let's be honest, the whites who were against desegregation or integration of the school were so violent that Eisenhower sent federal troops and nationalized the National Guard to make sure that these black kids were able to go to school in Little Rock, Arkansas. Okay. Now, when it comes to the federal courts, I guess you could say the federal courts began to carve out a judicial beachhead for civil rights. One of the decisions is called Smith versus Allwright. Smith versus Allwright. In this case, the United States Supreme Court, by a vote of 8-1, will outlaw the white primary. And the white primary was mainly used by Democrats in the South, and that was that the Democrats would hold a primary, but no black people could vote in the primary. Thus, whoever was elected, chosen as this Democratic nominee, black people had no choice in the matter. And in this decision, the Supreme Court is going to say, Smith versus Allwright, that the white primary was illegal because the white primary had excluded black people from participating in the Democratic Party primary in southern states. And basically, since almost all the people elected in the southern states were Democrats, that was like that the African Americans were being disenfranchised. Oh, how did it go one time? And they even used this in Eastern Kentucky at one time. And that is, if there was a Republican running for a yellow dog, that the whites would vote for the yellow dog running as a Democrat. They were not going to vote for a Republican. And this law about the primary kept black people from voting, and thus, if you're not voting in the primary, you really had no decision, no say in who was going to be chosen to political office in the South. Of course, in 1954, under Earl Warren, is where the Supreme Court is going to hand down a unanimous decision in Brown versus the Board of Education. Brown versus the Board of Education involved the desegregation of schools in not just Topeka, Kansas, but in four other places. The Supreme Court combined five cases into one. And this is where the Supreme Court is going to say, quote, in the field of public education, separate but equal has no place. And separate but equal then was inherently unequal. That was written into the decision. And as I stated in class, and we may get a chance to talk about it, part of the rationale for the decision of the Supreme Court is going to be the doll test. And back once again to a point that we've talked about education. And the doll test was where African Americans had been educated to believe that they were inferior and that they were not beautiful, and that they wanted to be like whites. And the Supreme Court is going to accept that rationale and will say that that was because of segregation. So, but my point is, 1954, the Supreme Court unanimously will rule and support the desegregation of the schools. And in 1955, the Supreme Court is going to come back and say that the schools should be desegregated. And the phrase they use, which is very interesting, is with all deliberate speed. And to this day, I'm not sure what all deliberate speed means, but the bottom line is the decision was the schools were supposed to be, public schools were supposed to be desegregated. Right. There were also in the 1960s decisions about reapportionment. Reapportionment determines the voting landscape, who you will vote for in terms of the House of Representatives, for example, especially in the House of Representatives, and even in the state legislature. And in Kentucky, it has been used that way to make sure now that there are more Republicans than there are Democrats. And one of the cases is called Baker versus Carr, that will uphold lawsuits that challenge districts that were apportioned to enforce voting discrimination against minorities. Gray versus Sanders was a case where the Supreme Court invalidated Georgia's county unit voting system, which gave rise to the concept of one man, one vote. There were decisions in 1964 that were important, that once again nullified what was occurring in Georgia, and while also validating the 14th Amendment's provision for equal representation for equal numbers of people in each district. Okay? So I'm saying to you, the Supreme Court will do some things even before and after Brown versus Board of Education that will move this nation closer to what it should become, closer to the American dream. Congress is going to lag behind. Bottom line, Congress is going to lag behind because, as I tried to say in class, you have the president or the executive branch, you have the judicial branch, and you have the legislative branch. You can see it this way. The executive branch is like a monarchy. The legislative branch is like an aristocracy. The judicial branch is like an aristocracy. The legislative branch is like a democracy. The system that is the most difficult to change is a minority because sometimes the people who are in the majority believe that the majority rules no matter what. And so Congress will be the most difficult to change. Also, a part of the difficulty is that there were very few black members of Congress to form a voting bloc powerful enough to change how the institution worked. And so until the fall elections of 1964, there were only 5 African Americans in Congress. And I'm not going to go over all the names, but one that you definitely should remember would be Adam Clayton Powell. That's somebody that has gotten lost in history, but was very crucial in the 1960s. And in 1967, John Conyers will join the House and represent a district in Michigan. And Edmund Brooke will enter the Senate in 1967. So there will be African Americans in Congress, but they will have limited influence. But once again, you have to crawl before you can walk, and they will be eventually important. because they were determined, they were energetic, and they were impassioned. So there were not a lot of them, but they will be in Congress fighting for change. Okay. And you got to remember also in Congress you had people then with different personalities, different legislative styles. They disagreed over the best way to achieve civil rights. Um, and like I said, the most symbolic leader was Adam Clayton Powell, but he was a polarizing figure. Uh, and what I mean by polarizing, he was a person who he attracted positive attention, but he also attracted negative attention. There were other allies and in Congress that I would say to get a chance you need to study them. But I'm saying by the makeup of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives, it was very difficult for African Americans to get anything done there, and especially in the Senate, because the Southern senators held the key positions, the leadership positions, and they were also the most skilled politicians and the most skilled parliamentarians. There were people like Richard Russell of Georgia, uh, who used constitutional concerns about his being against federal interference in state issues. So that's how he would stop civil rights legislation. Then there were just plain old fashioned uh, segregationists, I would say diehard racist segregationists, and especially out of the state of Mississippi, the senators James Bartama and Theodore Bilbo. They were just racist, another way to put it about it. But because they had been in Senate so long, they had power, and they used that power, especially from 53 to 65, to kill almost every single one of the more than 122 civil rights measures that Congress considered. Almost every single one of them were killed in the Senate. Okay. But what was also happening though at that same time is that African Americans are going to be putting pressure on, and we'll talk about that later, the pressure that they were putting on. But I want to talk about what did occur and what the positives. We're not going to focus upon the negative. One final negative I will focus upon is the senators, the people I mentioned, Russell, Thurman, uh, Harry Byrd Sr. of Virginia. They will pass something called the Declaration of Constitutional Principles. And it was like a Southern manifesto. Uh, in the Southern Manifesto, and this was signed in 1956, it will attack the Supreme Court decision. It will accuse the justices of abusing judicial power and trespassing upon states' rights. Okay? And this document will be signed by 82 members of the House of Representatives and 19 senators. So it's like 1/5 of the Congress. And it will urge Southerners to exhaust all lawful means to resist the chaos and the confusion that would result from school desegregation. And so my point is that it will be more difficult to get change in Congress because of the power that these white Southern senators and members of the House of Representatives had. And it was almost like to be elected, you had to out segregate your opponent. This is what, for example, George Wallace did when he was running for governor in Alabama. He lost his first election because he came across as a moderate. He did not lose another election because he made sure that he came across as a segregationist. And you got to remember, African Americans were basically not in the political process at that time. Now, of the legislation, you should remember 1957, the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Okay? And this legislation will pass the House of Representatives, and there will be opposition from Southerners. Uh, and it will definitely also have to pass, it will pass the Senate. But keep this in mind, people that were helping to pass civil rights legislation at that time were normally Republicans. So I want you to understand, we've got something going on in America now. So many African Americans will say something negative about the Republicans. But in the 50s and the 60s, it was the Republicans that was passing civil rights legislation. And it was Southern Democrats who were standing in the way of that legislation. And a person who will play a crucial role in breaking up the Southern filibuster was Lyndon Baines Johnson. And somebody I'll talk about more in a few minutes. All right, so the Civil Rights Act of 1957, it will eventually pass the Senate, okay? And it will be signed by President Dwight Eisenhower. It was the first major civil rights measure passed since 1875. It will establish a 2-year United States Commission on Civil Rights. It will create a civil rights division in the Justice Department. But its powers to enforce voting laws and punish the disenfranchisement of black voters were feeble. But I guess you could say it was the first step. Okay? And a few years later, there will be a Civil Rights Act in 1960. Once again, that will be weakened by Southern opponents, that will extend the life of the Civil Rights Commission and will stipulate that voting and registration records in federal elections must be preserved. Okay? Once again, Southerners are going to the law will pass, but Southerners are going to weaken it. So I'm saying to you that Southerners, that even though they still stood in the way, there will be progress made in Congress. And I think we got to give credit to especially moderate Republicans and Northern Democrats that did that. I know some people would say they really love JFK, John F. Kennedy, okay, and there's Robert Kennedy. But the person I think we overlook sometimes, and it may be because of what happened in Vietnam, is Lyndon Baines Johnson. Lyndon Baines Johnson, who became president after John F. Kennedy was assassinated. I remember when the 45th president of the United States, Donald Trump, would always say that he'd done more for black people than any other president than Abraham Lincoln. Well, first of all, Abraham Lincoln didn't free us, so I'm not sure what he did. But that's where I say we forget Lyndon Baines Johnson. Because under Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, in 1963, a major civil rights bill was presented in Congress. And this was because of the protests that were occurring throughout the South, the pressure that was being put on by average, everyday African Americans and their allies. This was, and being led by King and others. We'll talk about that, like I said, in another lecture. But the Kennedy administration was reluctant to pass a significant civil rights bill. Okay, and they weren't sure that the federal government had the ability to stop segregation in the schools. Okay, so even though Kennedy is remembered, and some of you might remember, you go into the households of older African Americans and you would see a portrait of John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr. I don't know how many of those were sold. And yes, my mother had one of those also. But the president who made it possible to pass the civil rights legislation was LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And in February 10th, 1964, Congress will pass the Civil Rights Act. And 138 Republicans will help to pass the bill. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 will contain sections that will prohibit discrimination in public accommodations in state and municipal facilities, including schools, and any program that receives federal aid. The act also prohibited discrimination in hiring and employment, created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to investigate workplace discrimination. The big hurdle was in the Senate, but the advantage that Johnson had over Kennedy is Johnson was a much more of a horse trader In politics, that means he's a better politician. He put the pressure on, and on June the 10th, 1964, for the first time in history, the United States Senate invoked closure on the Civil Rights Bill. In other words, it stopped a filibuster. It stopped the filibuster, and Congress, the Senate voted by a vote of 71 to 29 to cut off the debate, cut off the filibuster. This is a problem that Biden is facing. And it was a filibuster of 75 days. 75 days that the Senate, the Southern Democrat, 75 days that they would not let any legislation go through Congress. Okay? And on June the 19th, 1964, the Senate will pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and Lyndon Johnson will sign it into law. The second piece of legislation passed under Johnson's leadership will be dealt with voting rights. And of course, with voting rights, this is where you've got to remember what happened with Bloody Sunday, March the 7th, 1965. Okay, and everything that was captured on camera. And we all remember what happened to John Lewis. Okay? And Johnson, after seeing this, will address the joint session of Congress. And he spoke about the events in Selma. And legislative action was swift. The bill moved through both chambers, the House and the Senate. And the bill that moved through both chambers will suspend the use of the literacy test for a 5-year period. There will be poll workers stationed at polling places. There will be registers in states with federal registers with a state or persistent pattern of voting discrimination. Any changes to an election law had to be approved by the Justice Department. And it will make it a crime if you obstruct an individual's right to vote and make it a federal crime. And in 1965, then, the Senate will pass it by a vote of 77 to 19. And the House will pass it on July the 9th. And on August the 6th, 1965, President Johnson will sign the voting rights legislation. And there will be So this measure then is going to increase voter registration in a short time. By 1969, 60% of all Southern Black people were registered to vote. And the vote will have the biggest effect in the Deep South. In Mississippi, for example, where less than 7% of the African Americans were qualified to vote in 1964, by 1968, 59% of them were registered to vote. By 1975, approximately 1.5 million African Americans had registered to vote in the South. Now, that legislation, there will be some legislation, I think it was a few years ago, that the United States Supreme Court ruled, I can't remember the exact wording, but they ruled that some part of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional. And that has led to part of the situations that we have now, that Congress needs to pass something to put back into place to make sure that the rights of every citizen are protected. Okay. Also, at this time, we have to remember there will be an amendment to the Constitution that will be passed. An amendment to the Constitution will make it unconstitutional to have a poll tax. So you've got the Voting Rights Act, and now you got a constitutional amendment to make it make the poll tax unconstitutional. And the final piece of legislation will be in 1968. And this was designed to extend the legal protections outlawing racial discrimination beyond what had occurred in 64 and 65. And this legislation will, once again, there's going to be opposition. Okay? But this opposition, once again, is going to be defeated. It's going to be a long, drawn-out process. And what will occur in 1968 is that there will be the passage of what is called the Civil Rights legislation of 1968. And I would call it basically the Fair Housing legislation, where 64 would be the Civil Rights Act, 65 would deal with voting, 68 will deal with discriminatory housing practices. And that is, if you have the money, you should be able to buy in whatever neighborhood you want to buy in. There should be protections for you. This is the one, if you start noticing some of the announcements when people are trying to sell property or whatever, and they will just look at the sign, look at the little messages that are there. They to make sure that when it comes to housing, that an African American should be able to buy wherever they want to. This is legally. Now, I'm not talking about reality. Reality is something different because quite often it might depend on the neighborhood. There's discrimination based upon income. Um, but in 1968, then, there will be the legislation that will be passed, the legislation that will deal with fair housing. So what I'm saying is that from 1945 to 1968, there will be changes that will occur in the attitude of the federal government. It will not occur overnight. Notice it's a 23-year period. But you start seeing gradual changes that will occur that will help lead to a society, a more just society that we have now versus what occurred in 1945 or even before that what we've dealt with in this class. My focus today has been upon the federal government. It has been upon the president. It has been upon the Supreme Court and some of the decisions that the Supreme Court will render. It has been upon Congress. And even though there will be Southern Democrats standing in the way, eventually the legislation will pass. But as I stated, part of the reason this will occur is because of what African Americans especially began to do after 1945. Okay? So, the next lecture will deal with African Americans. Yes, there will be white allies, but what will occur in during this time period we call the second Reconstruction is African Americans begin to take the leadership for making change. They begin to put their lives on the line. They begin to march. They begin to sit in. They begin to boycott. And as I've always said, yes, there will be older African Americans that will do this. But a lot of this will be led by college students, especially African Americans at Southern HBCUs. Yes, that is true. Because remember, the Southern colleges like UK and U of L is a different category. WKU are in a different category. But most of the Southern colleges that are predominantly white, the number of black students there in this time was very, very, if there were any, it was very small. Very few of them. The changes, the protests, the sit-ins, they were led by African American college students at HBCUs. And many of those individuals, it is still years now that they are having their records expunged and convictions have been removed from their records. And I think about some of the discussions we had in class. At that time, the leadership of many of the HBCUs, some of these schools were being led by white, some of them were being led by African Americans, usually male, who were very conservative. And their viewpoint was they didn't want to upset the whites, who quite often were providing the money to keep the institution alive. So the next lecture then deals with what African Americans will do, and I will try and probably highlight some of the major events that will occur from 45 to 68. That will, and 68 is like the official end of the civil rights movement, and that will lead to the Black Revolution that you're going to be writing about uh, in terms of how this one college student dealt with it, being a definite minority at a predominantly white school uh, in the late 60s and early 70s. All right, take care. Bye.